Okay, let's make a start. So thank you for joining us this morning to look at the question, why do software projects go wrong? So we're going to look at some of the common reasons why that happens, and we're also going to look at some solutions, some things you can do to try and avoid those sorts of outcomes. So let's start by considering why it is that software projects go wrong. So often it seems to be the case that you start with a great plan, but it doesn't work out the way you intended it. So why is it that software development seems to be so difficult? And if you're not a technical person, software development can seem like a very opaque process. So what is it that software developers actually do? And according to the Standish Chaos Report, 31% of IT projects are cancelled before they are completed, and only 16% are delivered on time and budget. So there is a significant problem here. Now, to be fair, smaller companies have a better track record than larger companies. So it may be that some of the issues apply more to larger companies than they do to perhaps startups or SMEs. But nonetheless, there's still a clear problem here, and I think a perception too that software projects are difficult to deliver. And there are many reasons for that. And in this webinar, we're going to look at a few common ones and what you can do to avoid or correct them if they start to happen. So first of all, what I'd like to do is just invite you to contribute to a little poll, which I'm going to start now. So in the poll, we're just asking you to let us know, have you been involved in a software project that has failed? And if you have, what were the main reasons for that occurring? And if you haven't been involved in a software project that's failed, then congratulations. But also maybe you could give us some guesses as to why you think software projects often do fail. And if you're going to click other as the reasons for the primary reason for failure, you can also pop any ideas you've got into the chat, just so that we can refer to them and possibly come back and address them in questions at the end. So great to see we've got some responses coming in. 100% say yes, they've been involved in software projects that have failed, so that kind of lives up to the expectations. And it's interesting to see that budget seems to be the major issue that's coming up here. I'll just give it another few seconds just for the last few of you to vote on that. It's quite helpful for us just to see what people are thinking. We can always try and tailor some of the content, and particularly future content. All right, that's fantastic. So I'm going to end the polling now. And you can see that, as I say, 100% of people have been involved in software failure. So we're obviously talking to a group who've understood this and experienced this. And budget, as we say, is the, I should have shared results. Budget is the reason, the primary reason. Budget overruns and poor estimation are the primary reasons for that. So thank you for that. That's really interesting to get your feedback on that. So here's our top 5 reasons why software projects fail. So reason number 1, lack of stakeholder buy-in or commitment. Now, to be fair, this isn't the same problem for small companies or early stage software-based startups as it is for larger organizations. But even if you're in an SME or in a startup, you're still going to need buy-in from some stakeholders other than yourself to deliver your project. And if there isn't that sort of full commitment from the top, if there isn't the sort of championing of the project, you're almost bound to run into problems. So it might be a lack of access to some vital resources at some point in the project that you're going to need to unblock. It may be an inability to fix some kind of issue. But lack of buy-in is a project killer. And then coming in at number 2, we have lack of user engagement. So it doesn't matter what kind of project or software project you're doing, It doesn't matter if it's a consumer-facing app, if it's a B2B platform, if you're implementing software in an enterprise, you're going to need someone to represent your users to you. And they may be users themselves, or it may be some kind of product manager that you've brought in to do that role, or maybe you yourself who's fulfilling that function. But somebody has to understand what users want, and they have to represent that into the project team. Otherwise, you're going to build something that isn't what users want, and that's not going to get you very far. Then number 3 on our list, dysfunctional software processes. So you may have buy-in, you may have a good understanding of your user requirements, but if your software team isn't able to deliver the project that you need, then it's going to end up in trouble. So it could be that you have the wrong people on the job. It could be that they're just not working together very effectively. Maybe they're not motivated. Maybe they don't feel any passion for the project. Maybe you don't have the right QA processes in place to make sure that the software you get is up to scratch. Number 4 on our list here is a lack of focus. And it's very easy, particularly I think in early stage startups, for software teams to be prioritized on a given task and then very quickly moved on to another one, perhaps as some new information comes in, or there's a change of idea. And we encourage agility. We support the idea of the lean startup, but there also needs to be consistency. A project team, a software team needs to be able to deliver something. It becomes very demoralizing for them if they're constantly being reprioritized and never get a chance to finish anything properly. And then finally, number 5 is our unreasonable expectations. And perhaps that is the closest to the budget issue that seemed to come up top in the poll. It can be the case that software teams are put under unreasonable pressure to deliver miracles. There may be good business reasons why you've got into that position, but actually what happens when you put developers under extreme pressure is they start to cut corners. And if you create too much pressure, what you do is actually slow development down, not speed it up. You get software that becomes poor quality. Corners are cut, as we say, so functionality may not be implemented. It may be that developers badly understand what is required because you're rushing to try and get through, and the software that's produced can be buggy. And we refer to this as technical debt. One day, technical debt has to be repaid. So if you end up accumulating too much technical debt, it can become too much of a burden for a software project to complete. However, it's not all doom and gloom, because we're going to look at some solutions to those 5 problems. And top of my list, if you remember, was stakeholder buy-in. So if you're in that position where you feel you don't have buy-in from your key stakeholders, what can you do? And my first piece of advice is don't start until you've got it. Now, that's almost a flippant answer, and it's certainly very easy for me to sit here and say it, and it's much harder to do in practice. But honestly, I think that's possibly the best piece of advice you're going to hear today. If you don't have commitment from your stakeholders, you are on a hiding to nothing. It's going to be very difficult to deliver your project. So if you don't have it, or you don't feel that you've got it in sufficient quantity, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is to identify somebody who can make a clear decision, who can say, we are either going to do this or we're not going to do this. You can perhaps build go, no-go milestones into your project so that there's an opportunity for the organization to commit to the start of a project, but not feel that they've made a massive commitment all the way through to the end. And there's an opportunity then for you to perhaps introduce some leverage later on in the project. It's really important to understand why you're doing a given piece of software development. And I would refer you to our previous webinar on purpose, if you're wanting some more advice on how to define the why of your software project. And we published an article on that subject too. So what is your purpose? Why are you doing this project? What business value is it going to bring? And why would people use your software? And then the third point I would make here is define success. What does success look like? How will you know when you've achieved it? It's really important to make that clear. What will success look like for the business? Will it be increased revenue, increased numbers of users? Perhaps you'll acquire some new data that you didn't have before. Perhaps reputation. Perhaps what you're doing this project for is to build reputation or competitive position. These are all good reasons. It's worth articulating them. And you may also think about, what does failure look like? What is it? What would it mean for our business if this project did not succeed? Would it be game over? Or would we actually just be able to continue more or less as we were? So, second on the list is engaging with users. And my first piece of advice is, again, ludicrously simple. If you want to engage with users, then just ask them. But somehow it seems to be missed. So there are various strategies for asking users what they want. You could conduct some interviews. You could run some workshops with your target user base. But what you're looking for is to understand what's important to them. And that may be very different from what's important to you. And if you want some more advice on that, then we actually have a webinar on that subject too. So go back and look at our effective software webinar, and you'll hear a bit more about that. But don't just ask them at the start and don't go back. You need to keep testing things with your users. As you build things, you can test them out. So it might be showing some early designs and prototypes to your users. You might run some sessions where you ask them to perform specific actions in your software, and then you record what they do or what they say as they do that. And make sure that you consider your users in your design. So make sure that your users can actually use your solution. Designs are best when they are simple, where it is obvious what actions a user can take and why they would do that. And it's clear and simple how to use your software. And don't forget as well to think about all of your potential users, not just the most able-bodied. So consider accessibility. Otherwise, you'll exclude a significant proportion of your potential user base. You may measure. It's a good idea to measure what's actually happening after you've deployed your software. So conducting some surveys, maybe capturing Net Promoter Score, those kinds of things can be really useful. And check for feedback. It could be, for example, if you're developing an app and you've deployed that to the app or Play Store, that users are putting comments on your Play Store listing. So it's very important to check those comments and see what's going on. You may find some really valuable information there. You may have a support team who are helping field questions from your customers. So try and make sure that you're gaining feedback from the support requests. See if there are patterns, things you can do to correct. And if you've got a Twitter account, you may find there's some feedback on there too. So number 3 in our list, effective software processes. How are we going to make sure that our software team does what we want? So the first question is actually, have you got the right team? And we're going to drill into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. It's also important to remember, have we got the right QA processes in place? Are we assuring quality in what we do? And we're going to look at testing in a bit more detail in just a second. Now, are you communicating effectively to your developers? Are you communicating the requirements? Are they clearly defined? Are you giving your developers an opportunity to think about the requirements and discuss them before they start coding? You need to make sure that your developers have a clear understanding of what it is you want them to do. And then, are they team communicating effectively with each other? This is really the basics of team management. It's not just about software development, but have you got the right team together? Do they work well together? Are they communicating effectively? Now, that's harder to achieve if you're not all co-located in the same office, as most of us aren't these days. And so you need to work harder to overcome those problems. And then finally, do the team understand why they're doing this? Are they motivated? Do they catch the vision? Do they believe in the project? If you haven't got that level of commitment, it's going to be very difficult to succeed in your project. So let's think for a moment about getting the right team. Where are all the good developers these days? I think it's true to say that in the UK at least, good developers are in short supply. they're costly and they're quite difficult to find. But at the same time, there are a lot of people around the world who call themselves developers, but perhaps aren't that great. And it can be very difficult to pan for gold, as it were. If you post a job advert in Upwork or some similar platform for a software developer, you're going to get a lot of responses, but they're not necessarily going to be any good. And part of the reason for that is because there are very low barriers to entry with software development. Now, if you want to be an accountant or a lawyer or an architect, doctor or an airline pilot, any of those kind of professions, you need to have the right qualifications. You can't do the job without the qualifications. There's a recognized process, and that guarantees a level of understanding in those professions. But there's no equivalent in software development. There are some certifications, but there isn't any recognized universal standard in the same way. Basically, you can just watch a few YouTube videos and then you can call yourself a software developer. And of course, there are many different kinds of software developer as well. So you need to think about getting the right one for the job that you're trying to do. It's not just about technical qualifications. Do they understand the programming language you want to use? There are front-end developers who are good at making front-end look nice. There are back-end developers who understand how to implement business logic, people who are better at data manipulation and deriving value from data, maybe people who are better at working on the low-level code. So it's important to make sure that you get the right person for the job. But let's take a moment to celebrate our software development community. Right, a good software developer is like a craftsman. They are skilled at what they do. They have experience that they have built up over time, and they know how to apply their craft to create the right result. Now, we did a little bit of reading around, and we particularly like some research from Microsoft and the University of Washington that defined great software developers along 4 dimensions. So the first one is their personal characteristics. Are they open-minded? Are they always seeking to improve? Do they have passion for the job they're doing? The second is decision-making. So can they handle complexity? Software development is a complex job. A good developer needs to be able to see the forest and the trees. Are they a team player? Do they create a good and safe space for their colleagues to work in? Do they share their knowledge? Are they willing to mentor? And then finally, their technical skills. Do they have the right technical skills to combine both elegance and creativity? Good software is elegant, but it also has an element of creativity to it. It's not just a logical task. A good technical developer anticipates need and is attentive to details. So with those things in mind, if you've pulled together your ideal software development team, it might just be one person or it may be a large group. You also need to consider some of the other roles, and one of the most important is to make sure that you have good QA. Quality assurance is vital to getting the results that you need. Just think for a moment about testing. So testing provides the structure that holds your software in place. This is really a topic for a webinar in its own right, but testing is one of the most powerful weapons you've got for ensuring successful delivery of your software. So there are different levels of testing. We test at the module level, we test at integration level, we test at a functional level to see is the software doing what we wanted it to do, and then we test at the user level to make sure that users get the value from the software that we anticipated. Writing lots of software tests doesn't guarantee that you've got great code. It's important to make sure that your testing is substantive, that it actually tests something reasonable, and that it has broad coverage. So you're not just testing the same joint over and over again, you're actually testing the whole structure. As I say, we could spend a lot longer on QA, but we're doing a whistle-stop tour through software failure, and now we've arrived at solution number 4. You'll remember the problem here was around focus. And my advice here is to deploy frequently. So the only way really to know whether you've got good software is to get people to use it. You may, in the early stages of your project, just be deploying to some kind of test environment rather than to a sort of full-blown release. But you've got to get people using your software as quickly as you possibly can. And that is the most guaranteed way to find out whether you've got what you need. And don't just deploy, but also keep checking. Make sure that users are using your software, whether it's in a test mode or in real life. And if they are, instrument it so that you know what pages they visit or what buttons they click, what functions they choose to use. Collecting data about how your users behave and then reviewing and learning from it is a really valuable way to understand how well your software is functioning. And as we said before, pay attention to feedback. And it's really important to circle back to your business objectives. Why did you set out to write this piece of software? Have we achieved what we aimed to? If we didn't, why is that? Have we got something wrong in our understanding of how users are going to behave? Or was the original requirement not stated correctly? So circle back and understand what's the impact that our software is having on the business once we've deployed it. And then solution 5, achievable goals. So here we touch on that issue of budget overruns and estimation. So do you have a robust process in place for estimating how long it's going to take to deliver your software or how complex that software is? Do you have a refinement process where you're seeking to understand your requirements better, to build and share that knowledge, and to document it so that everyone is clear? Refinement meetings are a really good forum for trying to understand the complexity of a given requirement. But then if you're looking at the higher level, how do you plan? How do you come up with a realistic idea of how long it's going to take to deliver a piece of software over a period of time? Do you capture metrics about how your software team performs so that you've got some basis on which to make some predictions and that you can use for your forward views? Do you consider risk when you're considering your planning, or do you just assume that everything is going to go well? And do you understand and consider complexity? The more complex and risky something is, the chances are the longer it's going to take. It's also really important to think about what is acceptable behavior for your project team. And by that, I don't just mean, what their dress sense is, but how they do the job that you've asked them to do. What's acceptable behavior for your development team? One of the strongest ways of ensuring that is through the process of code review. Have you documented any coding standards for your team? And we're going to look into a little bit more detail on that on the next slide. But before we do, are you sure that your team isn't subject to scope creep? So we talked before about the dangers of not finishing something and then being reprioritized. Do you define your objectives clearly and do you stick to them? Do you have a well understood way of prioritizing any changes that might come to the fore that's aligned to your business objectives? And finally, is your team empowered? So are they able to feel that they are in control of their destiny? Now, clearly there are balances to be struck here, but a software development team needs to feel that it has the ability to improve things for themselves and to be in control of how they work. So they need to be motivated and engaged. It's kind of a leadership issue. Are you creating the right environment for your team? But it's also important to think about things like the retrospective process that's part of the Scrum project management orthodoxy. Are you actually thinking about, are we doing this job well? Could we be doing this job better? So as I say, let's just think for a moment about software maturity. And we define software maturity against these 3 pillars. So a mature, successful piece of software is secure, it's reliable, and it's maintainable. And all of those things are built on the foundation of simplicity. You can think of it a bit like Lego bricks. So an individual Lego brick is a very simple thing, but with a collection of Lego, you can build a very complex structure. And that's how good software should be built. Now, it's a sad fact that all software that is exposed to the outside world is subject to some kind of attack. There are plenty of bad actors out there who are more than happy to maybe try and get information from your system, or just to pass the time by trying to cause some damage. So you need to keep security at the forefront of your mind throughout your development process. It's one of the things that builds trust. Doesn't matter what you're developing, security is always going to be an issue. Now, reliable software that doesn't crash, doesn't have bugs, and it does what you want it to do in a simple way, is obviously really important. You can reasonably expect as a user that your software is going to do the thing that you want it to do. Now, clearly, there's no such thing as bug-free software, and it's a bit like a track and trace system. The more testing you do, the more you can suppress your bugs. And then finally, maintainability. So maintainability is really important because no matter what happens, the software is going to change. We always say software is never finished. And well-written software is maintainable. It's understandable by your future developers. It's easy to identify if something has gone wrong, where that problem arises, and it's easy to make changes. And as we say, one of the best ways of achieving these goals is through a process of code review. So if you haven't got a code review process set up in your team, I would strongly recommend that you consider doing so. Now, I want to just take a moment to also think about agencies. Many of you may use software development agencies to deliver your projects. And unfortunately, there are some unhelpful behaviors that you'll see in software development agencies, even though it can be a great way of delivering your project. And the first one here is, is bid low and hook them in. So this is almost endemic in the industry, that agencies will start off with a very low price to try and tempt you to come and work for them, because they know that once you start working with a given development agency, it's actually quite hard to move to another one. There's always going to be cost moving from one group to another. So some agencies will pretend that they can deliver something really cheaply. They'll bid really low, knowing and being confident that they can make that money back on future versions, future releases, or change requests. You may find, if you're working with an agency, that actually you just get bugs coming back. And that's an indication that there's something wrong with their quality assurance process. The worst thing would be to observe the same class of bug occurring in multiple different places. That would really indicate that there was something wrong. Obviously, you're not likely to get charged by an agency for bug fixing, depending on quite how you've contracted, but it's still going to delay you, and it's still going to reduce confidence in your solution if you're getting software that's very buggy. Another thing that agencies will sometimes do is become a bit obsessive about the spec. You will have to define a spec to work with an agency. There has to be some basis on which you're contracting and you're instructing them as to what to do. But you don't want to get into a position where even the most minor deviation from the spec ends up with a conversation about having to spend more money. It's always better to have a bit of elasticity on both sides in order to get the project delivered. There's also a bit of an issue around spec blindness sometimes, where you've set out a spec, but what actually gets delivered isn't what you asked for. And again, that's probably an issue that there's something wrong with their QA processes, that they are allowing software to be released to you when it's not aligned with what you asked for. Again, you may not get charged for fixing that problem, but it's still going to delay and reduce confidence. And then the final point I want to make is about change inflators. So that's where you agree that a change is needed, you agree that a change request is justified, but they come back with an inflated cost for making that change. That could be a symptom of my first point, or it may just be that actually they don't want to make that change, or perhaps they don't have the resources to do it, or that you're getting into that problem that we talked about earlier, where the code that's built isn't simple and it isn't maintainable, and therefore changes become really expensive. So if you're working with an agency, it's good to try and resolve those problems up front. You can do that contractually. You can do that by reviewing their QA processes before you start, by talking to other people who've worked with that agency and hopefully getting good reports from them. I realize that choosing an agency is a big decision. It's really important for you, particularly if you're a relatively small organization. And often it's done on the most weakest of reasonings, but it's good to think about these points as you're going through your selection process. Make sure you get the information you need. And then I just want to take a moment to think about, do your developers actually know what to do? Have you taken the trouble to write your requirements down? I guess this is referring back to the spec point that we were talking about with the agency just now. Now, ideally, we like to see requirements documented as user stories. That's great because it doesn't just capture the functionality that you want, but also the motivation. It's really important to understand the motivation behind a requirement. Why is this something that is required? We talked earlier about refinement a little bit. And again, refinement of your requirements with your development team is really important. So have you got some forum in which you spend time with your developers trying to get them to understand the requirement that you have, and for them to ask questions and think through what the implications of that can be? And you very often get a situation where developers will say, well, we can do whatever you want. But what you want to understand is, well, actually, what's the easiest way to solve this problem? You can only get that through discussion. You need that technical input to get to that most creative way of solving a given problem. When you write your requirements, do you also write acceptance criteria? These are really valuable for helping developers understand what is required and ensure that what they present to you is what you actually wanted in the first place. So don't just write the user story, but write the acceptance criteria to go with it, so everyone knows what done looks like. And we mentioned before also the idea of retrospectives. It's part of the Scrum process. Even if you're not following a Scrum process, these are still really valuable, where you get your team together and just get them to think about what went well in the last period that we're considering, what went badly, and what can we do about that? How can we make that better? So no one is perfect straight out of the gate. No team is going to just land and be perfect from day one. The most important thing is that you make commitment to continuously improve. That way you'll get better and better at delivering the software that you need. So there we have it, our top 5 solutions for software failure. So we talked about gaining stakeholder buy-in. We talked about the importance of engaging with your users, finding out what they really want, and continuously doing that through the process. We've talked about having effective software processes and building the right team. We talked about how difficult it is to get a great software developer and how difficult it is to engage with the right agency. Stay sharp, stay focused on your purpose. Make sure that you're always doing the most valuable thing with your software development team, and have achievable goals. Don't try and achieve the impossible, because you're just setting yourself up to fail. Now, this all sounds really simple to say, but it's much harder to do in practice. Kind of like playing chess. Easy to learn the rules, but it takes a lifetime to master. So ultimately, software development is a team sport. It requires collaboration, not just between your developers, if you have a team, your front-end, back-end developers, but also maybe you have people who are involved in architecture and design, technical design. Maybe you have interface designers, maybe you have UX people who are trying to work out what the user experience should be. Hopefully you have some form of QA involved in your team, and most likely you would have a project manager trying to tie all of this together and make sure that everyone is pulling in the same direction. So it's not just about hiring a developer, it's about hiring a team. Sometimes one person has to perform multiple roles in order to get what you want. But other times you may end up with a large software team, and success in both cases can be really challenging, but it's not impossible. Most software development projects do achieve some kind of success. Those original numbers that we looked at are very stark, but if you drill into it in a bit more detail, often the case is that some value was derived from a given software project, even if it wasn't quite what was originally set out. And maybe budgets were stretched or exceeded, but ultimately, was there a return on investment? So success is possible. Now, we at 500 or more are quite experienced at delivering software projects, and we've dealt with a number of failing projects in our time as well. So we can provide simple audits of a given software project. We can do an assessment of your code base to really understand where you are and give you some more information to work from. We can help you put those right structures in place and help to ensure that you have successful software at the end of the day. So if any of that sounds of interest, then don't hesitate to contact me. Now, we've got a few minutes, so I'm going to see if there are any questions from anyone at this point. Please feel free to pop any questions you have into the chat, and I'll be happy to try and answer them. I'd like to point out that we will be making the recording of the webinar available. Now, if you haven't done so, we'd urge you to have registered on our Eventbrite page to make sure that you get that straight away. If you haven't done that and you want to get a recording of the webinar, you can just contact us directly. We'd be keen to make sure that you have the opportunity to refer back to this material if it's useful. And I know that the end of these sessions sometimes take a minute or two for questions to arise, so we'll wait for a little bit longer and see if any questions are coming in. All right. Well, no questions so far, so hopefully we've dealt with all the... Oh, there we go. Just as I thought we had answered everything. We have a question here. How do you resuscitate a project that has stalled out? That's a really interesting question, because if a project has actually ground to a halt or is just not delivering anymore, I think the first thing you need to do is actually be honest about the situation. And often that can mean getting everyone together and having a session to make sure that you capture what's really going on. It's obviously really important in that scenario to create some safety. Most people who were in a project in this situation would be aware that things were not right. And so you need to make sure that people feel comfortable at speaking out. If you can't do that in a group session, then you need to spend time with individuals. So you need to get to the root of the root cause of the problem. And often that's not the immediate, obvious challenge. If you know a little bit about some of the quality management techniques, this issue of the approach called 5 whys. So you're always trying to drill that down into what's the really underlying problem here. We observed that this happened, but why did that happen? Okay, it happened because of this. Well, why did that happen? What you're trying to do is to get to the real root cause of the problem. And if you don't do that, then what you find is actually that problems just keep occurring. So we have another question here. Are the acceptance criteria technical and defined in the project requirement specification, or are they commercial and defined in a contract? So that's a very good question. I guess you could apply them at different levels. Now, when I talked about acceptance criteria earlier, I was attaching them to the specification. So I was attaching them to the technical specification. So you would think in terms of a user story, which might be, you know, as a user, I want to do X, and then Y as a reason. And then below that, you would define what are the acceptance criteria. So, you know, user is able to do X. If user does Y, then Z happens, those sorts of things. So they're really aimed at trying to explain in more detail to the project team what the requirements really are. But it is also interesting that you mentioned commercial and defined in a contract. So if you're in the position of defining a fixed price contract to work with a supplier, then defining acceptance criteria is actually a really good way of making sure that you that there's no argument about whether the specification has been met. So I would argue that you would probably want to do both if you could. So are there any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. And look forward to either speaking to you in the near future or seeing you on the next webinar, which will be in a couple of months' time. Thank you and goodbye.